It was 3:17 a.m. when Evelyn heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling her tent. But she was camping alone, 15 miles from the nearest road. Welcome to Verified Fears, where we dive into the darkest corners of human experience. Tonight, we're exploring 11 of the most bone-chilling encounters that happen deep in the world's most isolated forests. These stories will make you question everything you thought you knew about what lurks beyond the tree line. From silent watchers who follow hikers for miles, to ancient guardians of forgotten burial grounds, to voices that call your name from empty wilderness. Each tale will drag you deeper into a realm where your worst nightmares become reality. But before we descend into this abyss of terror, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Because at Verified Fears, we fearlessly explore the horror that others won't dare touch. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when our next nightmare drops. Now, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's enter the woods where sanity goes to die. Let's move to our first story. Deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, a group of experienced hikers encountered something that defied every natural law they understood about forest ecosystems. This happened to Henry Chen, a wildlife biologist, and his research team during what should have been a routine biodiversity survey in October 2019. What they discovered in those ancient woods would fundamentally change their understanding of nature itself. Henry had been leading ecological surveys for over 15 years, documenting everything from bird migration patterns to insect populations across the Pacific Northwest. His team consisted of 3 graduate students and a local guide named Tom Whitehorse, who had been navigating these particular mountains for over 3 decades. They were investigating reports of unusual wildlife behavior in a remote section of the Cascade Range, an area so isolated that it required a 6-hour hike just to reach the research site. The forest they entered was old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar, some trees dating back over 800 years. It was the kind of pristine wilderness that most people only see in documentaries. The first day proceeded normally. They set up their base camp near a small creek and began documenting the usual forest sounds and wildlife activity. Henry noted healthy populations of Douglas squirrels, various songbird species, and fresh deer tracks throughout the area. The forest was alive with the typical symphony of wilderness sounds. Wind through the canopy, bird calls, rustling undergrowth, and the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. Everything seemed perfectly normal as they collected soil samples and recorded audio of the local ecosystem. It was on the second morning that everything changed. Henry woke at dawn to begin his routine audio recordings, a practice he had followed on hundreds of research trips. But as he stepped outside his tent with his recording equipment, he immediately noticed something profoundly wrong. The forest was completely silent. Not the peaceful quiet of early morning, but an absolute, unnatural silence that seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical force. There were no bird calls, no insect buzzing, no wind through the trees, no sound of the nearby creek. Even his own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air had become thick and sound-absorbing. Henry initially thought there might be a predator nearby. Sometimes the presence of a large carnivore can cause other wildlife to fall silent temporarily. But this silence was different. It was total and oppressive, creating an atmosphere of dread that made his skin crawl. He checked his audio equipment, thinking it might be malfunctioning. But the devices were working perfectly. They were simply recording nothing but dead air. He walked toward where the creek should have been audible, but even standing directly beside the flowing water, he could hear nothing. The water was moving. He could see it cascading over rocks, but it produced no sound whatsoever. When his team members began emerging from their tents, they immediately noticed the unnatural quiet. Sarah, one of his graduate students, whispered that she felt like they were inside a soundproof chamber. Tom, the experienced guide, had gone pale and was scanning the tree line with obvious anxiety. In 30 years of guiding people through these mountains, he had never experienced anything like this. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt alive, watchful, and malevolent. As they moved through their morning routine, every action felt amplified and wrong. When someone accidentally dropped a metal cup, it should have clanged loudly against the rocks. Instead, it made only the faintest thud, as if the sound was being absorbed by some invisible force. Their voices, when they dared to speak, sounded flat and lifeless, lacking the natural resonance that voices have in outdoor spaces. It was as if the forest itself was swallowing every sound they made. The most disturbing aspect was how the silence affected their psychological state. Within an hour, the entire team was experiencing intense anxiety and paranoia. They found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, expecting to see something watching them from the shadows between the trees. The oppressive quiet created a sense of being observed by unseen eyes, as if they had wandered into territory where they were decidedly unwelcome. Henry decided to conduct an experiment. He had brought along an emergency air horn for bear encounters, something that should produce a sound audible for miles in normal forest conditions. When he activated it, pointing it toward the open sky, the result was terrifying. The horn produced only a weak, muffled sound that seemed to die just feet from where he stood. It was as if something was actively suppressing all sound within a specific radius around their campsite. Tom suggested they leave immediately, but Henry's scientific curiosity was stronger than his fear. He wanted to document this phenomenon and understand what could cause such complete acoustic suppression in a natural environment. They spent the day taking measurements and recordings, but every piece of equipment confirmed the same impossible reality. Sound was being absorbed or blocked by something they couldn't identify or understand. As the day progressed, the psychological pressure intensified. The graduate students reported feeling dizzy and disoriented, as if the lack of normal environmental sounds was affecting their inner ear balance. Henry himself began experiencing a persistent headache and a growing sense of claustrophobia, despite being in an open forest. The silence was so complete that they could hear their own heartbeats and the sound of blood flowing through their ears, creating an internal cacophony that contrasted sharply with the dead quiet of their surroundings. By afternoon, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. While exploring the perimeter of the silent zone, they found its exact boundaries. The supernatural quiet had a precise edge. They could step from complete silence into normal forest sounds within a single footstep. On one side of an invisible line, birds sang and insects buzzed normally. On the other side, absolute silence reigned. The boundary formed a perfect circle, roughly 200 yards in diameter, centered on their campsite. Tom finally convinced them to pack up and leave when they made their final disturbing discovery. Scattered throughout the silent zone, they found dozens of small animal skeletons, birds, squirrels, even a young deer. All appeared to have died recently, but there were no signs of predation or disease. The animals seemed to have simply collapsed and died where they stood. Henry collected several specimens, but the implications were terrifying. Whatever was causing the silence was also lethal to wildlife. As they hiked out of the area, the moment they crossed the boundary back into normal forest, the natural sounds returned like a wall of noise hitting them. Birds called, insects buzzed, and the wind rustled through leaves with almost overwhelming intensity after hours of supernatural quiet. The relief was so profound that Sarah began crying, and even Tom, the hardened mountain guide, was visibly shaken. Henry never published his findings from that expedition. The evidence was too bizarre, too impossible to explain within the framework of accepted science. But he never returned to those mountains, and he never forgot the feeling of being watched by something ancient and hostile in that circle of unnatural silence. The forest had shown them that there are places where the normal rules of nature don't apply, where something far older and more powerful than human understanding still holds dominion over the wilderness. Let's move to our second story. In the remote forests of northern Maine, where logging roads stretch for miles without seeing another soul, a family camping trip turned into a nightmare that would haunt them for years. This happened to David Martinez and his wife Claire, along with their 2 teenage children, during what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway in August 2021. What they encountered on those isolated backwoods roads would shatter their sense of safety in the wilderness forever. David had been planning this camping trip for months, researching the perfect spot deep in the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. He was an experienced outdoorsman who had been taking his family on camping adventures since his kids were small. The location he chose was accessible only by a series of increasingly narrow logging roads, each one taking them further from civilization and deeper into the vast Maine wilderness. The final stretch required driving nearly 40 miles on unmarked dirt roads, passing through dense forests of spruce and fir that seemed to close in around their vehicle like living walls. They arrived at their chosen campsite late Friday afternoon, a beautiful clearing beside a pristine lake that reflected the surrounding mountains like a mirror. The spot was everything David had hoped for. Completely isolated, surrounded by untouched wilderness, and so remote that they hadn't seen another vehicle for the last 2 hours of driving. They set up their tents, built a fire, and spent the evening enjoying the kind of peace that only comes from being truly disconnected from the modern world. The kids complained about the lack of cell service, but David and Claire relished the opportunity to unplug completely. Saturday passed perfectly. They hiked along game trails, fished in the lake, and explored the surrounding forest. As evening approached, they prepared for another peaceful night under the stars. But as they were settling around the campfire after dinner, Claire noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through the trees, barely visible in the fading light, she could see the outline of a vehicle parked on the logging road about 100 yards from their campsite. It was a dark-colored sedan, possibly a Volvo, just sitting there motionless in the gathering darkness. David initially dismissed her concern, suggesting it might be other campers who had arrived late and were setting up their own site. But as the hours passed, the vehicle never moved. No one emerged from it, no lights came on, and no sounds of camping activity could be heard. The car simply sat there in the darkness, its occupants invisible behind tinted windows. When David shone his powerful flashlight in that direction, the beam revealed the vehicle clearly. It was indeed an older model Volvo sedan, completely out of place on these rough logging roads designed for heavy trucks and four-wheel drive vehicles. The family tried to ignore the mysterious presence, and continue their evening. But the knowledge that someone was watching them from the darkness made relaxation impossible. Every time they looked toward the road, the vehicle was still there, silent and ominous. David decided to walk over and make contact, thinking perhaps the occupants needed help or were lost. But as he approached the tree line, something made him stop. The car was positioned in such a way that it blocked the only exit from their campsite. Anyone wanting to leave would have to drive directly past the mysterious Volvo. Claire suggested they pack up and leave immediately, but David pointed out the obvious problem. They would have to drive past the unknown vehicle to reach the main logging road. In the darkness, on unfamiliar terrain, with no cell service and no way to call for help, they were effectively trapped. The realization that they were completely isolated with potentially dangerous strangers sent waves of panic through the family. David made the decision to stay alert through the night and leave at first light, when they would have better visibility and tactical advantage. The night became a sleepless vigil of terror. They extinguished their campfire to avoid being silhouetted against the flames and took turns keeping watch from inside their tents. Every few hours, David would carefully peer through the tent flap toward the road. The Volvo never moved, never showed any signs of life. But somehow its presence felt increasingly menacing as the hours crawled by. The children whispered questions about who might be in the car and why they were just sitting there. But David had no answers that wouldn't terrify them further. Around 3 a.m, Claire woke David with urgent whispers. She had been watching the road when she saw a figure emerge from the passenger side of the Volvo. In the moonlight, she could make out the silhouette of a person walking slowly around the perimeter of their campsite, staying just inside the tree line. The figure moved with deliberate stealth, clearly trying to remain hidden while observing their tents. David grabbed his hunting knife and prepared to defend his family. But the figure eventually returned to the vehicle without approaching closer. The psychological torture continued until dawn. Every sound in the forest, a snapping twig, the call of a night bird, the rustle of leaves, sent adrenaline coursing through their systems. They were trapped in their own campsite, prisoners of an unknown threat that seemed content to simply watch and wait. The children barely slept, and when they did, they woke frequently with nightmares about shadowy figures surrounding their tents. As the first light of dawn began filtering through the forest canopy, David made the decision to pack up quickly and attempt to leave. They broke camp in record time, throwing gear into their SUV with shaking hands, while constantly glancing toward the road where the Volvo still sat motionless. David's plan was to drive directly toward the mysterious vehicle, hoping that daylight and the element of surprise would give them the advantage they needed to escape. When they reached the logging road, David stopped their vehicle about 50 feet from the Volvo and honked his horn repeatedly, trying to force some kind of response from the occupants. The sedan remained silent and still. David slowly drove closer, and as they passed alongside the mysterious vehicle, Claire peered through the passenger window. What she saw made her scream in terror. The car was empty, but the windows were covered from the inside with newspaper and duct tape, creating a makeshift blind that would allow occupants to see out while remaining completely hidden from view. They drove away as fast as the rough logging roads would allow, not stopping until they reached the main highway hours later. When they finally had cell service, David called the state police to report the incident. The authorities took their report seriously, given the remote location and suspicious circumstances. But when officers investigated the area 2 days later, they found no trace of the Volvo or its occupants. The vehicle had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The family never returned to that area of Maine, and David stopped planning remote camping trips altogether. The experience had shown them how vulnerable they were in the wilderness, how easily they could be trapped by someone with malicious intent. Claire still has nightmares about that figure walking around their campsite in the darkness, and their children refuse to go camping anywhere that doesn't have cell service and easy access to help. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter was the calculated nature of the threat. Someone had deliberately positioned their vehicle to trap the family, then spent an entire night watching them with unknown intentions. The newspaper-covered windows suggested premeditation and experience in surveillance. David often wonders what would have happened if they had tried to leave during the night, or if the mysterious watchers had decided to approach their campsite. The questions haunt him because he knows that in those remote Maine woods, no one would have heard them scream for help. Let's move to our third story. In the dense forests of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, where ancient trees create a canopy so thick that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor, a solo backpacker experienced something that challenged everything he believed about the natural world. This happened to Michael Thompson, a 34-year-old software engineer from Seattle, during a week-long hiking trip in September 2020. What he encountered in those primordial woods would leave him questioning his own sanity and forever change his relationship with wilderness solitude. Michael had been planning this solo backpacking adventure for over a year, meticulously researching the most remote sections of Olympic National Forest, where he could truly disconnect from the digital world that consumed his daily life. He was an experienced hiker who had completed dozens of solo trips throughout the Pacific Northwest, always seeking deeper wilderness experiences that would challenge him both physically and mentally. The route he chose would take him through some of the most isolated terrain in the lower 48 states, following abandoned logging roads and forgotten trails that hadn't seen human traffic in decades. The first 3 days of his journey proceeded exactly as planned. Michael hiked through cathedral groves of old-growth cedar and Douglas fir, some trees so massive that it would take 6 people holding hands to encircle their trunks. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature. The distant call of ravens, the scurrying of small mammals through the underbrush, and the ever-present whisper of wind through the towering canopy. He made excellent progress on his planned route, covering nearly 15 miles each day, while stopping frequently to photograph the stunning wilderness around him. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. Michael had set up camp in a small clearing beside a creek, following his usual routine of filtering water, preparing dinner, and settling in for the evening. As darkness fell, he noticed that the normal forest sounds seemed to be fading away, replaced by an unusual quiet that made him feel oddly isolated. But this wasn't the oppressive silence that some hikers report. Instead, it felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, as Michael lay in his sleeping bag, reading by headlamp, he heard something that made his blood freeze. From somewhere in the darkness beyond his campsite, a voice called his name. Not shouted, but spoken in a conversational tone, as if someone was standing just outside the circle of light from his camp. The voice was distinctly human, male, and seemed to come from the direction of the trail he had hiked earlier that day. Michael immediately turned off his headlamp and listened intently, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard throughout the forest. After several minutes of silence, he convinced himself that he had imagined the voice, perhaps dreaming while still partially awake. But as he was about to turn his light back on, the voice came again, this time from a completely different direction. "Michael," it said, clear and unmistakable, now seeming to come from across the creek. The tone was friendly, almost inviting, as if someone he knew was trying to get his attention. But Michael knew with absolute certainty that he was alone, miles from the nearest trail, in wilderness so remote that encountering another person would be virtually impossible. The rationale part of his mind searched for explanations. Perhaps it was another hiker who had somehow followed the same obscure route and was now looking for a place to camp. But the voice had come from two different directions, and there had been no sounds of someone moving through the forest, no footsteps, no rustling of vegetation, no equipment noise that would accompany a backpacker. The voice seemed to materialize from the darkness itself, unconnected to any physical presence. Over the next hour, the voice called his name repeatedly, each time from a different location around his campsite. Sometimes it seemed to come from high in the trees above him, other times from ground level in the dense underbrush. The tone remained consistently friendly and conversational, as if whoever was speaking expected Michael to respond and join them. But there was something fundamentally wrong about the voice, something that triggered every survival instinct he possessed and kept him frozen in his tent. Michael grabbed his most powerful flashlight and began scanning the forest around his campsite, desperate to identify the source of the voice. The beam revealed nothing but trees, shadows, and the normal features of the wilderness landscape. But as he swept the light across the forest, the voice seemed to follow the beam, always staying just outside the circle of illumination. When he pointed the flashlight toward the creek, the voice came from behind him. When he spun around to illuminate the area behind his tent, the voice shifted to his left side. The psychological torture continued throughout the night. The voice never became threatening or aggressive, maintaining its friendly, almost seductive tone. But the impossibility of the situation, a disembodied voice that seemed to move freely through the forest while remaining completely invisible, created a terror more profound than any physical threat. Michael found himself paralyzed by indecision, unable to determine whether he should respond to the voice, pack up and leave in the darkness, or simply wait for dawn while trying to maintain his sanity. As the hours passed, the voice began to change subtly. While still calling his name, it started to sound more familiar, as if it belonged to someone he knew well. At times, it reminded him of his father's voice. Other times, it sounded like his college roommate or his brother. The voice seemed to be adapting, becoming more personally appealing and harder to resist. Michael realized with growing horror that whatever was calling to him was somehow accessing his memories, using familiar voices to make him more likely to respond. Around 4 a.m, the voice made an offer that nearly broke his resolve. Speaking in what sounded exactly like his deceased grandfather's voice, it said, "Michael, come find me. I have something important to show you." His grandfather had been his closest family member, the man who had first introduced him to hiking and wilderness camping. The voice captured not just the sound, but the speech patterns and gentle tone that Michael remembered so well. For a moment, he actually considered leaving his tent to investigate. But something deep in his primitive brain screamed danger, overriding the emotional manipulation. Michael forced himself to remain in his tent, covering his ears and trying to block out the increasingly persuasive voices that continued calling from the darkness. He spent the remaining hours until dawn in a state of terror-induced paralysis, afraid to move, afraid to respond, and afraid of what might happen if he gave in to the voice's invitation. When the first light of dawn began filtering through the forest canopy, the voices stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The normal sounds of the forest returned: bird calls, rustling leaves, the babble of the creek. as if nothing unusual had happened. Michael packed his gear with shaking hands and began hiking out immediately, abandoning his planned route and heading directly for the nearest road. He covered nearly 20 miles that day, driven by a desperate need to escape the forest that had revealed something ancient and malevolent in its depths. Michael never completed another solo backpacking trip. The experience had shown him that the wilderness holds mysteries far beyond what modern science can explain, and that some places are inhabited by forces that view human visitors as prey rather than guests. He still hikes, but only with companions and never in areas as remote as the Olympic Peninsula. The memory of those friendly voices calling his name from the darkness continues to haunt him, and he often wonders what would have happened if he had been weak enough to answer their invitation and step into the forest night. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter was how the voices seemed to know him personally, adapting their approach to exploit his emotional vulnerabilities and family connections. Whatever was calling to him in that forest possessed an intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly sophisticated, capable of psychological manipulation that nearly overcame his survival instincts. Michael knows that he came dangerously close to becoming another missing person statistic in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, lured away from safety by voices that promised answers but delivered only darkness. Let's move to our fourth story. In the remote wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, where ancient ridges hide secrets that predate human civilization, a group of college friends encountered something that transformed their weekend camping trip into a nightmare they would never forget. This happened to Jessica Martinez and her 3 roommates during their spring break adventure in March 2022, deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest of Kentucky. What they witnessed in those fog-shrouded hollows would shatter their understanding of what inhabits the darkest corners of America's oldest mountain range. Jessica had organized this camping trip as a way for her friend group to bond before graduation scattered them across the country. She was a pre-med student at the University of Kentucky, known for her meticulous planning and love of outdoor adventures. Her companions were equally accomplished. Amanda studying environmental science, Rachel pursuing a degree in psychology, and Morgan majoring in anthropology. They were all experienced hikers who had spent countless weekends exploring the trails and backwoods of Kentucky. But none of them had ventured as deep into the wilderness as Jessica's chosen destination. The location Jessica selected was a remote section of the Daniel Boone National Forest, accessible only by a series of increasingly treacherous dirt roads that wound through dense forests of oak, maple, and pine. The final approach required hiking 3 miles along an abandoned logging trail that hadn't been maintained in decades. Their destination was a secluded valley that Jessica had discovered while researching historical maps of the region, a place so isolated that it didn't appear on modern topographical surveys and seemed to have been forgotten by the outside world. They arrived at the valley on Friday afternoon, setting up camp in a clearing beside a small stream that meandered through the hollow. The location was breathtakingly beautiful, surrounded by steep ridges covered in old-growth forests that created a natural amphitheater of green. The isolation was complete. They hadn't seen another person for the last 6 hours of their journey, and their cell phones showed no signal whatsoever. It was exactly the kind of pristine wilderness experience Jessica had hoped to share with her friends before they all went their separate ways. The first evening passed peacefully. They built a campfire, shared stories, and marveled at the brilliant display of stars visible in the unpolluted mountain sky. The forest around them was alive with the normal sounds of Appalachian wildlife. The distant call of barred owls, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush. and the ever-present whisper of wind through the ancient trees. They felt completely safe in their remote paradise, protected by the natural barriers of the surrounding ridges and the knowledge that they were miles from any human threat. Saturday morning brought an unexpected change in weather. A thick fog rolled into the valley just after dawn, reducing visibility to mere yards and creating an otherworldly atmosphere that transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and mysterious. The fog was unlike anything they had experienced before. Dense, almost tangible, and strangely warm despite the cool mountain air. It seemed to move with purpose, swirling around their campsite in patterns that defied the gentle breeze they could feel on their faces. As they prepared breakfast in the eerie fog, Amanda noticed something that made her pause mid-conversation. Through the thick mist, she could see a figure standing motionless at the edge of their campsite, barely visible as a dark silhouette against the gray backdrop. The figure appeared to be human in shape, but was completely covered by what looked like a long, flowing veil or shroud that obscured any details of face or form. It stood perfectly still, as if watching them, but made no sound or movement that would indicate normal human presence. Jessica grabbed her binoculars and tried to get a better look at the mysterious figure, but the fog seemed to shift and thicken whenever she focused on it, making clear observation impossible. The figure remained motionless for several minutes, then slowly began to move parallel to their campsite, staying at the same distance but changing position as if circling their camp. The movement was unnaturally smooth and silent, with no sound of footsteps or rustling vegetation that should accompany someone walking through the forest. The four friends huddled together, trying to decide how to respond to this unexpected presence. Rachel, with her psychology background, suggested it might be another camper who was lost or disoriented in the fog. But Morgan, whose anthropology studies had exposed her to Appalachian folklore, felt a deep unease that she couldn't rationally explain. The figure's appearance and behavior reminded her of the old mountain stories about entities that were neither fully human nor entirely supernatural, beings that inhabited the boundary between the world of the living and something far more ancient and dangerous. As the morning progressed, the veiled figure continued its slow circuit around their campsite, always maintaining the same distance, but never approaching closer or moving away. The fog seemed to follow it, creating a moving wall of mist that made tracking its exact position nearly impossible. Whenever one of them tried to approach the figure directly, it would fade back into the fog, only to reappear moments later in a different location. The psychological effect was profoundly unsettling, creating a sense of being stalked by something that operated by rules they couldn't understand. Around noon, the fog began to thin slightly, giving them brief glimpses of the surrounding forest. What they saw made their blood run cold. The veiled figure was not alone. Through the shifting mist, they could make out at least 3 other similar forms positioned at different points around the valley, all maintaining the same watchful stillness. The figures appeared to be coordinating their movements, creating a loose perimeter around the campsite that effectively trapped the 4 friends in the center of the hollow. Jessica made the decision to pack up and leave immediately. But as they began breaking camp, the fog thickened again, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The veiled figures seemed to respond to their activity, moving closer and becoming more active in their circling behavior. The friends could hear what sounded like whispered conversations in the mist, voices speaking in a language none of them recognized, but that somehow conveyed a sense of ancient authority and barely contained malevolence. The most terrifying moment came when Rachel, who had been gathering their scattered gear, suddenly screamed and pointed toward the tree line. One of the veiled figures had approached to within 20 feet of their campsite and was standing perfectly still, its shrouded form clearly visible despite the fog. For the first time, they could see details of its appearance that made their rational minds struggle to process what they were witnessing. The veil or shroud appeared to be made of some kind of organic material that seemed to move and shift on its own. And beneath it, they could glimpse what looked like pale, elongated limbs that were definitely not human in proportion. The figure raised what might have been an arm and pointed directly at Jessica, holding the gesture for several long seconds before slowly lowering it and fading back into the fog. The message was clear. They had been marked, identified, and were being watched by something that possessed intelligence and intent. The friends abandoned any attempt at organized packing and simply grabbed their essential gear before fleeing toward the trail that would lead them out of the valley. The hike out became a nightmare of paranoia and terror. The fog followed them, and they could sense the veiled figures moving through the forest parallel to their route, always staying just out of sight, but making their presence known through subtle sounds and glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision. Every shadow seemed to hide a watching form. Every rustle of leaves suggested pursuit by entities that moved according to laws of physics that didn't apply to normal human beings. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, and even then, they could feel unseen eyes watching them from the forest as they loaded their gear and drove away. The fog seemed to follow them for miles, only dissipating when they reached the main highway and the safety of civilization. None of them spoke during the drive home, each lost in their own attempts to process what they had experienced in that remote Appalachian valley. Jessica never organized another camping trip, and the four friends rarely spoke about their encounter with the veiled figures. But the experience had marked them all, leaving them with the knowledge that the ancient mountains of Appalachia harbors secrets that predate human understanding and entities that view intruders in their domain as unwelcome guests to be watched, evaluated, and potentially eliminated. The veiled ones had allowed them to leave, but the friends knew they had been judged and found wanting, marked by something that existed in the spaces between the known and unknown worlds of the American wilderness. Let's move to our fifth story. In the remote forests of Northern California, where towering redwoods create a cathedral of shadows and silence, a group of environmental activists encountered a nightmare that would leave them permanently scarred, both physically and psychologically. This happened to Robert Chen and his team of forest preservation volunteers during what should have been a routine documentation mission in October 2021. What they experienced in those ancient groves would transform their peaceful environmental work into a fight for survival against human predators who had claimed the wilderness as their hunting ground. Robert had been leading environmental protection efforts in Northern California for over 8 years, organizing volunteer groups to document illegal logging activities and monitor the health of old-growth forest ecosystems. His team consisted of 6 dedicated volunteers, including marine biologist Sarah Kim, forestry student Marcus Williams, and photographer Elena Rodriguez, who specialized in capturing evidence of environmental crimes. They were investigating reports of unauthorized timber harvesting in a protected section of Humboldt County, an area so remote that it required a 2-day hike through dense forest to reach the suspected logging sites. The location they were investigating was a pristine grove of ancient redwoods, some trees over 1,000 years old, and reaching heights that seemed to touch the sky itself. The forest floor was carpeted with centuries of fallen needles, creating a soft, silent pathway through the towering giants. Their mission was to document any signs of illegal cutting and gather photographic evidence that could be used to prosecute environmental criminals who were systematically destroying irreplaceable wilderness areas for profit. On their second day in the forest, as they were photographing what appeared to be recent chainsaw cuts on several massive trees, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through her telephoto lens, she could see a makeshift camp hidden among the trees about a quarter-mile from their position. The camp consisted of several tarps stretched between trees, camping equipment, and what looked like a collection of chainsaws and logging equipment. But what terrified her most was the sight of at least 4 men moving around the camp, all carrying what appeared to be hunting knives and machetes. Robert immediately realized they had stumbled upon an illegal logging operation. But this wasn't the kind of corporate environmental crime they usually documented. This appeared to be a rogue operation run by individuals who had no connection to legitimate timber companies and who were operating completely outside the law. The remote location and heavily armed nature of the group suggested they were prepared to defend their illegal activities with violence, treating the protected forest as their personal territory where normal laws didn't apply. The team tried to retreat quietly, but the loggers had apparently been watching them for some time. As Robert's group attempted to slip away through the forest, they heard shouts from behind them and realized they were being pursued. The illegal loggers were experienced woodsmen who knew the terrain intimately, and they moved through the forest with a speed and stealth that made escape seem impossible. Within minutes, the environmental activists found themselves surrounded by 4 men who emerged from the trees like predators closing in on cornered prey. The leader of the group was a tall, bearded man in his 40s who carried a large hunting knife and spoke with the casual authority of someone accustomed to violence. He informed Robert's team that they had trespassed on private property and witnessed activities that they weren't supposed to see. The man's tone was conversational, but carried an unmistakable threat of violence, and his companions fingered their weapons while studying the activists with the cold calculation of experienced predators evaluating their victims. What followed was 6 hours of psychological and physical torture that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The loggers forced the environmental team to march deeper into the forest, away from any possible rescue. While discussing among themselves what to do with the witnesses to their illegal operation, the activists were bound with rope and forced to sit in a circle while their captors debated whether to simply scare them into silence or eliminate them permanently to protect their lucrative timber theft operation. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical violence that followed. The loggers seemed to take pleasure in describing in graphic detail what they had done to previous environmental activists who had discovered their operation. They spoke casually about bodies buried in the forest, about people who had simply disappeared without a trace, and about the complete isolation of their location that made rescue impossible. The environmental team realized with growing horror that they had stumbled into the territory of individuals who viewed murder as a routine business expense. Marcus, the youngest member of the group, was singled out for particularly brutal treatment when he tried to reason with their captors. The loggers used their knives to inflict shallow cuts on his arms and face. Not deep enough to cause serious injury, but sufficient to demonstrate their willingness to escalate the violence. The psychological impact of watching their friend being tortured while being powerless to help created trauma that would affect the entire group for years to come. As evening approached, the situation became even more desperate. The loggers had apparently decided that the environmental activists posed too great a threat to their operation to be allowed to live. They began discussing logistics of disposal, talking about locations where bodies could be buried so deep in the forest that they would never be found. The casual nature of these conversations, as if they were discussing routine work tasks, revealed the depth of evil that the activists had encountered in the remote wilderness. The turning point came when Elena managed to work her hands free from the ropes binding her wrists. During a moment when their captors were distracted by an argument about the best method of execution, she was able to grab a heavy piece of firewood and strike one of the loggers in the head with enough force to knock him unconscious. The sudden violence created the chaos that Robert's team needed to attempt an escape into the darkening forest. What followed was a nightmarish chase through the redwood groves, with the remaining loggers pursuing them with flashlights and weapons, while shouting threats of what they would do when they recaptured their victims. The environmental activists had no knowledge of the terrain and were running blind through a forest that their pursuers knew intimately. They separated into pairs, hoping to confuse their hunters and increase the chances that at least some of them would survive to report the crimes they had witnessed. Robert and Sarah managed to evade capture by hiding in a hollow beneath the roots of a massive fallen redwood, remaining motionless for hours while their pursuers searched the area around them. They could hear the loggers calling to each other, coordinating their search pattern and discussing the consequences of allowing witnesses to escape. The hunt continued throughout the night, with the environmental activists hiding in terror while armed criminals combed the forest looking for them. Elena and Marcus were less fortunate. They were recaptured after several hours and subjected to additional torture as punishment for their escape attempt. The loggers used their knives to inflict more serious injuries, leaving permanent scars that would serve as reminders of their encounter with human evil in the wilderness. Only the arrival of dawn and the loggers' need to return to their illegal cutting operation saved the activists from being murdered outright. When the sun rose, the surviving members of Robert's team managed to find each other and begin the long hike out of the forest. They were traumatized, injured, and psychologically shattered by their encounter with predators who had turned the protected wilderness into their personal hunting ground. The 2-day journey back to civilization became a race against time, as they knew the loggers might pursue them to prevent them from reporting the crimes they had witnessed. Robert's team did eventually reach safety and report their ordeal to law enforcement. But the investigation that followed revealed the challenges of prosecuting crimes committed in such remote locations. By the time authorities reached the logging site, the criminals had vanished, leaving behind only evidence of their illegal timber harvesting and no trace of their identities or whereabouts. The environmental activists had survived their encounter with human monsters, but justice remained elusive in the vast wilderness where such predators could operate with impunity. The psychological scars from their ordeal proved more lasting than their physical injuries. Several team members required extensive therapy to deal with the trauma of being tortured and nearly murdered by individuals who viewed environmental protection as a threat worthy of lethal response. Robert disbanded his volunteer organization, unable to risk exposing other activists to the kind of human predators who had claimed the remote forests as their territory. The ancient redwoods they had tried to protect continued to fall to illegal chainsaws, while the criminals who had terrorized them disappeared back into the wilderness where they continued their destructive work beyond the reach of law and justice. Let's move to our 6th story. In the vast wilderness of the Cascade Range in Oregon, where endless miles of dense forest can swallow entire groups without a trace, 8 college friends embarked on what should have been a celebratory camping trip before graduation. This happened to Jennifer Walsh and her group during their final spring break together in April 2023, deep in the Mount Hood National Forest. What began as a joyful reunion in the wilderness would end with 6 people vanishing without explanation, leaving only two traumatized survivors to tell a story that authorities still refuse to fully investigate. Jennifer had been planning this reunion camping trip for months, bringing together her closest friends from Oregon State University for one last adventure before they scattered across the country to begin their careers. The group included her roommate Ashley, her boyfriend Derek, and 5 other friends who had shared countless memories throughout their college years. They were all experienced outdoor enthusiasts who had spent numerous weekends hiking and camping throughout the Pacific Northwest. But this trip was special. A final celebration of their friendship before adult responsibilities pulled them in different directions. The location Jennifer chose was a remote section of the Mount Hood National Forest, accessible only by a series of increasingly narrow Forest Service roads that wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock. Their destination was a secluded alpine lake that Jennifer had discovered during a solo hiking trip the previous summer. A pristine body of water surrounded by towering peaks and completely isolated from any established trails or camping areas. The lake was so remote that it didn't appear on most recreational maps, making it the perfect location for a private celebration away from crowds and civilization. They arrived at the lake on Thursday afternoon, setting up a large camp in a clearing beside the crystal clear water that reflected the surrounding mountains like a perfect mirror. The location was everything Jennifer had promised. Breathtakingly beautiful, completely isolated, and offering the kind of wilderness experience that would create memories to last a lifetime. They spent the first evening around a roaring campfire, sharing stories, playing music, and reveling in the freedom that comes from being completely disconnected from the outside world. Friday passed in perfect harmony with nature. The group hiked around the lake, explored the surrounding forest, and spent hours swimming in the surprisingly warm alpine water. As evening approached, they prepared for what they planned to be their most memorable night together. With a feast cooked over the campfire and a celebration that would honor their years of friendship. The mood was euphoric, filled with laughter and the bittersweet joy of friends who knew they were experiencing something precious that would soon become just a cherished memory. It was around midnight on Friday when everything changed. Jennifer was awakened by what sounded like muffled screams coming from somewhere outside the camp. She emerged from her tent to find the campfire reduced to glowing embers and an eerie silence that seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical force. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized with growing horror that several of her friends' tents were empty, their sleeping bags still warm, but their occupants nowhere to be found. Ashley, who had been sleeping in the tent next to Jennifer's, was also awake and equally confused about the disappearance of their friends. Together, they searched the immediate area around the camp, calling out names and expecting to find their friends playing some kind of elaborate prank or perhaps dealing with a medical emergency. But the forest around them was completely silent, offering no response to their increasingly frantic calls for help. As they expanded their search, Jennifer and Ashley made a discovery that filled them with dread. Leading away from the camp toward the dense forest on the far side of the lake, they found a series of drag marks in the soft earth, as if several people had been pulled against their will into the wilderness. The marks were accompanied by what appeared to be drops of blood and scattered pieces of clothing that they recognized as belonging to their missing friends. The 2 survivors spent the remainder of the night in a state of terror, huddled together in Jennifer's tent while listening for any sound that might indicate the return of their friends or the approach of whatever had taken them. They debated whether to attempt a rescue mission in the darkness or wait for dawn when they would have better visibility and a clearer understanding of what they were facing. The decision was made for them when they heard sounds in the forest that convinced them they were being watched by unseen predators. Throughout the night, Jennifer and Ashley could hear what sounded like voices calling from deep in the forest. But the sounds were distorted and unnatural, as if their friends were trying to communicate from an impossible distance, or through some kind of barrier that muffled their words. The voices seemed to be pleading for help, but there was something fundamentally wrong about them that triggered every survival instinct the two women possessed. As dawn broke over the alpine lake, Jennifer and Ashley made the agonizing decision to abandon their search and hike out to get help from authorities. They packed only essential supplies and began the long trek back to civilization, leaving behind all evidence of their camp and their missing friends. The hike out became a nightmare of paranoia and guilt, as they constantly felt they were being followed by unseen watchers who might be responsible for their friend's disappearance. The most disturbing aspect of their escape was the discovery that the Forest Service roads they had used to reach the lake were now blocked by fallen trees that hadn't been there when they arrived. The obstacles appeared to have been deliberately placed to prevent vehicles from entering or leaving the area, suggesting that whoever had taken their friends had also planned to trap any potential witnesses or rescuers. Jennifer and Ashley were forced to abandon their vehicle and continue on foot, adding miles to their journey and increasing their sense of vulnerability. When they finally reached a ranger station and reported the disappearance of their 6 friends, the response from authorities was frustratingly inadequate. Search and rescue teams were dispatched to the area, but they found no trace of the missing campers despite extensive efforts involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and experienced wilderness searchers. The campsite had been completely cleaned, with no evidence remaining of the 8-person group that had been there just days before. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the drag marks and blood evidence that Jennifer and Ashley had observed were nowhere to be found when investigators arrived at the scene. The forest around the lake appeared completely undisturbed, as if the missing campers had simply vanished into thin air without leaving any trace of their presence or their fate. The lack of physical evidence led some investigators to question whether the 2 survivors were telling the truth about what had happened to their friends. Jennifer and Ashley were subjected to extensive questioning and psychological evaluation, with some authorities suggesting that they might have been involved in their friend's disappearance, or that they had suffered some kind of shared psychotic episode brought on by wilderness stress. The women maintained their story despite the skepticism they encountered. But the lack of supporting evidence made it impossible to launch a full criminal investigation into what they insisted was a case of mass abduction. The psychological trauma of losing 6 close friends and being unable to convince authorities to take their story seriously has left both survivors struggling with guilt, grief, and post-traumatic stress. Jennifer has never returned to the wilderness, haunted by the knowledge that her friends are still missing somewhere in the vast Oregon forests, and that whatever took them remains free to claim other victims. Ashley has required extensive therapy to deal with survivors' guilt and the constant fear that the entities responsible for the disappearances might return to eliminate the witnesses who escaped. The case remains officially unsolved, with the 6 missing campers listed as disappeared persons in a wilderness area where people sometimes vanish without explanation. But Jennifer and Ashley know the truth, that something predatory and intelligent operates in the remote forests of the Cascade Range, something that views human visitors as prey to be hunted and collected. Their friends didn't simply get lost in the wilderness. They were taken by forces that understand how to eliminate evidence and operate beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. The most haunting aspect of their ordeal is the knowledge that they were allowed to escape, suggesting that whatever took their friends wanted survivors to spread the story and create fear among potential future victims. Jennifer often wonders if she and Ashley were spared specifically to serve as witnesses, to carry the tale of what happens to those who venture too deep into wilderness areas where ancient predators still claim dominion over human intruders. Let's move to our 7th story. In the remote wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, where dense forests stretch for hundreds of miles without a single road or building, a family's peaceful camping trip became a terrifying ordeal that would force them to abandon everything and flee into the night. This happened to Thomas Rodriguez and his family during what should have been a relaxing long weekend in August 2022, deep in the High Peaks Wilderness area. What they encountered in those isolated mountains would shatter their sense of security and leave them questioning whether some places are simply too dangerous for civilized people to visit. Thomas had been planning this camping expedition for months, eager to share his love of wilderness backpacking with his wife Maria and their 2 teenage children, Sophia and Carlos. He was an experienced outdoorsman who had been exploring the Adirondacks for over 20 years. But this trip was special because it marked the first time his family would join him on a multi-day backcountry adventure. The location he chose was a remote lake, accessible only by a grueling 8-mile hike through dense forest, far from any established trails or popular camping areas. The journey to their destination took most of Friday, with the family carrying heavy packs loaded with camping gear, food, and water purification equipment. The trail they followed was little more than a game path that wound through thick stands of maple, birch, and pine, occasionally marked by faded blazes that Thomas had learned to recognize during his years of solo exploration. The lake they were seeking was so remote that it appeared on only the most detailed topographical maps. A pristine body of water surrounded by towering peaks that few people had ever seen. They reached the lake just before sunset on Friday, setting up camp on a small peninsula that jutted into the crystal-clear water. The location was everything Thomas had promised his family. Breathtakingly beautiful, completely isolated, and offering the kind of wilderness experience that creates lifelong memories. They spent the evening around a campfire, with Thomas sharing stories of his previous adventures while his family marveled at the brilliant display of stars visible in the unpolluted mountain sky. Saturday passed in perfect harmony with the natural world. The family hiked around the lake, explored hidden coves and waterfalls, and spent hours fishing from their campsite. Sophia and Carlos, initially skeptical about spending a weekend without internet or cell service, found themselves genuinely enjoying the peace and freedom that comes from complete disconnection from the digital world. As evening approached, they prepared for what they expected to be another peaceful night under the stars. It was around 11 o'clock on Saturday night when their wilderness paradise became a nightmare. The family was settling into their tents when they heard the sound of someone crashing through the forest toward their campsite. The noise was unmistakably human. Heavy footsteps, breaking branches, and what sounded like someone stumbling repeatedly over obstacles in the darkness. But they were 8 miles from the nearest road, in wilderness so remote that encountering another person should have been virtually impossible. Thomas emerged from his tent with a flashlight and was shocked to see a man stumbling into their campsite, clearly intoxicated and disoriented. The stranger was middle-aged, wearing torn clothing, and reeked of alcohol so strongly that the smell was overwhelming even in the open air. He was carrying what appeared to be a partially empty bottle of whiskey, and seemed surprised to discover other people in what he apparently considered his private territory. The man's behavior was erratic and threatening, swaying on his feet while staring at Thomas's family with bloodshot eyes that reflected the dying campfire. The intruder began speaking in slurred, aggressive tones, demanding to know what Thomas's family was doing in his forest, and suggesting that they had no right to be camping in the area. His speech was barely coherent, punctuated by profanity and veiled threats about what happened to people who trespassed on his territory. Thomas tried to remain calm and reasonable, explaining that they were legal campers in a public wilderness area. But the drunk man became increasingly agitated and hostile. What made the situation truly terrifying was the realization that this man had somehow reached their remote campsite despite being so intoxicated that he could barely stand upright. The 8-mile hike through difficult terrain would have been challenging for a sober, experienced hiker. Yet this stranger had navigated the route in darkness while severely impaired. The implications were chilling. Either he knew these mountains so well that he could travel them blind drunk, or he had been following Thomas's family since they began their hike. The drunk intruder began circling their campsite, stumbling through their gear while making increasingly threatening comments about what he might do to unwelcome visitors in his territory. He picked up their cooking utensils and examined them with obvious malicious intent, while making crude comments about Maria and Sophia that left no doubt about his predatory intentions. Thomas realized with growing horror that they were completely isolated with a dangerous individual who viewed their presence as both an invasion and an opportunity. Maria gathered the children into the largest tent, while Thomas tried to de-escalate the situation. But the intruder's behavior became more erratic and threatening as the minutes passed. He began throwing their camping equipment around the site, smashing their water bottles and scattering their food supplies, while ranting about city people who didn't belong in the wilderness. The man's actions suggested a level of territorial aggression that went far beyond simple drunken belligerence. He seemed to view their campsite as his personal domain that had been violated by unwelcome intruders. The turning point came when the drunk man began approaching the tent where Maria and the children were hiding, making explicit threats about what he intended to do to them. Thomas realized that reasoning with the intruder was impossible, and that his family was in immediate physical danger from someone who had clearly abandoned any pretense of civilized behavior. The isolation that had made their campsite so appealing now became a deadly trap, with no possibility of help arriving and no escape route that wouldn't require abandoning their gear and fleeing into the darkness. Thomas made the desperate decision to grab his family and run, abandoning their campsite and all their equipment in a frantic attempt to escape the drunk predator who had invaded their wilderness sanctuary. They fled into the forest, wearing only the clothes they had been sleeping in, carrying nothing but a single flashlight and the knowledge that they faced an 8-mile hike through difficult terrain in complete darkness. Behind them, they could hear the intruder destroying their campsite while shouting threats about what he would do if he caught them. The nighttime escape became a terrifying ordeal that tested the family's endurance and unity. They had to navigate treacherous terrain without proper equipment, following a barely visible trail while constantly looking over their shoulders for signs of pursuit. Sophia twisted her ankle on a hidden route, and Carlos developed severe blisters from hiking in inappropriate footwear. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that returning to their campsite meant facing a dangerous predator who had made his violent intentions clear. The most disturbing aspect of their flight was the realization that the drunk intruder seemed to be following them through the forest. They could hear sounds of pursuit in the darkness behind them, breaking branches, stumbling footsteps, and occasional shouts that echoed through the mountains. The man's ability to track them while severely intoxicated suggested a familiarity with the terrain that was both impressive and terrifying, indicating that he might be a permanent resident of the wilderness who viewed all visitors as potential victims. They reached their vehicle just as dawn was breaking over the mountains, exhausted, injured, and traumatized by their encounter with human evil in the remote wilderness. The 8-mile hike that had taken them most of Friday to complete had been covered in just 4 hours of desperate flight. Driven by adrenaline and the primal need to escape a predator who had turned their wilderness paradise into a hunting ground. They drove directly to the nearest police station to report the incident, but the response from authorities was frustratingly inadequate. The investigation that followed revealed the challenges of law enforcement in remote wilderness areas. By the time authorities reached the campsite, the drunk intruder had vanished, leaving behind only the destroyed remains of Thomas's camping equipment and no clues about his identity or whereabouts. The isolation that had made the location so appealing for camping also made it impossible to effectively investigate crimes committed there, allowing predators to operate with virtual impunity in the vast wilderness. Thomas and his family never returned to the Adirondacks, and their experience effectively ended Thomas's 20-year relationship with wilderness camping. The encounter had shown them that even the most remote locations can harbor human predators who view isolation as an opportunity rather than a sanctuary. The drunk intruder had transformed their family bonding experience into a nightmare that would haunt them for years, demonstrating that the greatest dangers in the wilderness often come not from wild animals or natural hazards, but from the human monsters who use isolation as cover for their predatory behavior. The psychological impact of their ordeal extended far beyond the immediate trauma of that night. Sophia and Carlos developed a lasting fear of wilderness areas, and Maria required therapy to deal with the anxiety and hypervigilance that followed their encounter with a predator who had invaded their safe space. Thomas was left with the haunting knowledge that his love of remote wilderness had nearly cost his family their lives, and that the mountains he had cherished for decades harbored dangers that no amount of experience or preparation could fully protect against. Let's move to our 8th story. In the ancient forests of the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, where sacred burial grounds predate European settlement by thousands of years, an archaeological team encountered guardians that have protected these hallowed sites since time immemorial. This happened to Dr. Catherine Williams and her graduate research team during what should have been a routine survey expedition in September 2023. Deep in the remote mountains, where indigenous peoples once laid their ancestors to rest. What they awakened in those sacred groves would teach them that some places demand respect that transcends academic curiosity and scientific methodology. Dr. Williams had been leading archaeological surveys throughout the southeastern United States for over 15 years, specializing in pre-Columbian indigenous sites that could provide insights into ancient Native American cultures. Her current project involved documenting and protecting burial mounds that were threatened by illegal artifact hunting and commercial development. The team consisted of 4 graduate students and a local Cherokee consultant named Joseph Crow Feather, who had reluctantly agreed to guide them to sites that his people considered sacred and potentially dangerous to disturb. The location they were investigating was a series of burial mounds hidden deep in the Cherokee National Forest, accessible only by following ancient footpaths that wound through dense stands of oak, hickory, and pine. The mounds were part of a complex that had been used for ceremonial burials for over 2,000 years, representing one of the most significant archaeological sites in the region. Joseph had warned the team repeatedly about the spiritual significance of the area and the traditional beliefs regarding the consequences of disturbing the ancient dead. They established their research camp on Tuesday morning in a clearing about half a mile from the burial complex, following strict archaeological protocols to minimize their impact on the site. Dr. Williams had obtained all necessary permits and had consulted extensively with Cherokee tribal authorities. But Joseph remained visibly uncomfortable with the entire expedition. He spoke in hushed tones about the old stories, the warnings passed down through generations, about places where the spirits of the ancestors still walked and protected their eternal resting places from those who would disturb their peace. The first 2 days of research proceeded according to plan. The team used ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive techniques to map the extent of the burial complex, discovering that it was far larger and more sophisticated than previous surveys had indicated. The mounds were arranged in precise patterns that suggested astronomical alignments and complex ceremonial purposes that demonstrated the advanced knowledge of the ancient builders. Dr. Williams was excited by the potential significance of their discoveries. But Joseph's unease continued to grow as they delved deeper into the sacred site. It was on Thursday evening that they encountered the first signs that their presence was not welcome. As the team was reviewing their data around the campfire, they began hearing what sounded like drumming coming from the direction of the burial mounds. The rhythm was slow and ceremonial, echoing through the forest with a resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. Joseph immediately recognized the sound as a traditional Cherokee funeral drum. But when they investigated the source, they found the burial complex completely empty and silent. The drumming continued intermittently throughout the night, always stopping the moment anyone approached the mounds, but resuming as soon as they returned to camp. Joseph explained that according to Cherokee tradition, the sound indicated that the spirits of the ancestors were gathering to protect their burial grounds from desecration. He urged Dr. Williams to abandon the research and leave the area immediately. But the archaeological team was reluctant to abandon their work based on what they considered folklore and superstition. Friday morning brought more disturbing phenomena. As the team began their daily survey work, they discovered that their equipment had been moved during the night. Despite the fact that they had secured everything carefully before retiring to their tents. The ground-penetrating radar unit had been relocated to the center of the largest burial mound, positioned as if someone had been examining it closely. More unsettling was the discovery of footprints around their equipment. Bare human feet that appeared and disappeared without forming complete trails, as if the individuals making them had materialized and vanished at will. Dr. Williams initially suspected that local artifact hunters might be interfering with their research. But Joseph's reaction to the footprints filled the team with dread. He identified them as belonging to the ancient burial practices of his people, explaining that the dead were traditionally buried barefoot to facilitate their journey to the spirit world. The implications of his statement were clear. The footprints belonged to entities that should have been resting peacefully in their graves, not walking among the living to investigate modern intruders. As the day progressed, the supernatural activity intensified. The team began seeing figures moving through the forest around the burial complex, always at the edge of their vision and always disappearing when observed directly. The figures appeared to be wearing traditional Cherokee burial clothing, white doeskin garments and ceremonial ornaments that gleamed in the filtered sunlight. Joseph confirmed that these were the spirits of the ancient dead, awakened by the disturbance to their sacred resting place and gathering to defend their territory from further intrusion. The most terrifying encounter occurred when graduate student Mark Peterson attempted to take photographs of the largest burial mound. As he approached with his camera equipment, a figure materialized directly in front of him. An elderly Cherokee man, wearing traditional burial regalia and carrying a war club that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The spirit spoke in Cherokee, words that Joseph later translated as a warning that the living had no business among the dead, and that continued trespass would result in the researchers joining the ancestors permanently. Mark fled in terror, but the encounter had lasting consequences. Within hours, he developed a high fever and began speaking in Cherokee, a language he had never studied or heard before his encounter with the burial ground guardian. Joseph recognized the words as ancient funeral chants, songs traditionally sung to guide the dead to their final rest. The graduate student was essentially channeling the voices of the ancient dead, serving as a conduit for spirits who were trying to communicate their displeasure with the archaeological intrusion. Dr. Williams finally acknowledged that they were dealing with forces beyond scientific explanation when their equipment began malfunctioning in ways that defied rational analysis. The ground-penetrating radar showed readings that indicated the burial mounds were empty, despite clear evidence of their archaeological significance. Digital cameras captured images of the spirits that appeared as solid figures to the naked eye, but showed up as transparent shadows in photographs. The electromagnetic anomalies around the burial complex suggested the presence of energies that current scientific instruments couldn't properly measure or understand. The final warning came on Friday night, when the entire team was awakened by the sound of hundreds of voices singing traditional Cherokee funeral songs. The chorus seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, rising from the burial mounds in a haunting harmony that spoke of ancient grief and eternal vigilance. Joseph translated fragments of the songs, explaining that they were warnings about the consequences of disturbing the sacred dead and promises of protection for the burial grounds that would extend beyond death itself. Saturday morning brought the decision to abandon the research project immediately. Mark's condition had worsened, and he was now speaking exclusively in Cherokee while describing visions of ancient burial ceremonies and spirit journeys that he couldn't possibly have knowledge of through normal means. The other team members were experiencing nightmares, equipment failures, and a growing sense of being watched by unseen guardians who were evaluating their intentions and finding them wanting. As they packed their equipment and prepared to leave, Joseph performed a traditional Cherokee ceremony to apologize to the spirits for the disturbance and to request safe passage for the research team. The ritual involved burning sacred tobacco and offering prayers in Cherokee that acknowledged the sovereignty of the ancient dead over their burial grounds. Only after completing this ceremony did the supernatural activity begin to subside, suggesting that the spirits were willing to allow the intruders to leave if they showed proper respect and promised not to return. The journey out of the forest was marked by a profound sense of relief as they left the sacred burial grounds behind. Mark's fever broke the moment they crossed the boundary of the burial complex, and he immediately stopped speaking Cherokee. With no memory of the ancient language or the visions that had possessed him, the team's equipment began functioning normally again, and the oppressive atmosphere of being watched by hostile spirits lifted like a weight being removed from their shoulders. Dr. Williams never published her findings from the Cherokee burial ground expedition, and she quietly withdrew her research permits for the site. The encounter had taught her that some places are protected by forces that transcend scientific understanding, and that the ancient dead have ways of defending their sacred resting places that modern archaeology is not equipped to handle. The burial mounds remain undisturbed, guarded by spirits who have proven their willingness and ability to protect their eternal domain from those who would treat sacred ground as merely another research site. The experience fundamentally changed Dr. Williams's approach to archaeological research, leading her to work more closely with indigenous communities and to respect traditional beliefs about sacred sites. She learned that academic curiosity must sometimes yield to spiritual sovereignty. and that the ancient guardians of burial grounds possess a power that demands acknowledgement and respect from the living. The Cherokee ancestors continue to rest peacefully in their sacred mounds, protected by vigilant spirits who have made it clear that some mysteries are meant to remain undisturbed by modern intrusion. Let's move to our 9th story. In the remote wilderness of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, where ancient peaks hide secrets that predate human memory, a solo hiker encountered something that would challenge everything he believed about the natural world. This happened to Daniel Foster, a 29-year-old park ranger, during what should have been a routine backcountry patrol in June 2023, deep in the San Juan National Forest. What he experienced in those isolated mountains would leave him questioning the boundaries between the living world and something far more ancient and mysterious. Daniel had been working as a park ranger for 7 years, spending countless hours alone in the wilderness, conducting wildlife surveys, maintaining remote trails, and ensuring the safety of backcountry visitors. He was comfortable with solitude and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the moods and rhythms of the forest. His current assignment involved patrolling a section of the San Juan Range that had been closed to public access due to reports of unusual wildlife behavior and several unexplained disappearances of experienced hikers over the past 2 years. The area he was investigating was a high-altitude wilderness accessible only by a grueling 12-mile hike through terrain that challenged even the most experienced mountaineers. The landscape was stark and beautiful, dominated by towering peaks that scraped the sky and alpine meadows that bloomed briefly during the short mountain summer. It was the kind of pristine wilderness that few people ever see. A place where the modern world seemed like a distant memory, and the ancient rhythms of nature still held absolute dominion. Daniel began his patrol on Monday morning, carrying enough supplies for a week-long expedition into the remote backcountry. His mission was to investigate reports of strange sounds and unusual animal behavior that had been reported by the few hikers who had ventured into the area before its closure. The reports were consistent but bizarre. Descriptions of whistling sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, wildlife that appeared agitated and fearful, and an overall atmosphere of unease that made experienced outdoorsmen uncomfortable. The first 3 days of his patrol proceeded normally. Daniel documented healthy populations of elk, deer, and mountain goats, along with evidence of black bears and mountain lions that indicated a thriving ecosystem. The wilderness seemed peaceful and undisturbed, with no obvious signs of the unusual activity that had prompted the area's closure. He began to suspect that the reports might have been exaggerated or misinterpreted by hikers who were simply overwhelmed by the profound isolation of the high country. It was on Thursday evening that Daniel first heard the whistles. He was setting up camp in a protected valley beside a small alpine lake when 2 sharp, piercing whistles echoed across the mountains. The sounds were clearly artificial, too precise and deliberate to be produced by any known wildlife. Yet they seemed to come from the peaks themselves. The whistles were separated by exactly 3 seconds, repeated 3 times, then followed by complete silence that seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical force. Daniel's first thought was that other hikers might be in the area, using whistles to communicate across the vast distances of the mountain wilderness. But the sounds had an otherworldly quality that made his skin crawl, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through his bones and trigger primitive fear responses that he couldn't rationally explain. The whistles were too loud, too clear, and too perfectly timed to be produced by human lungs, yet they were obviously intelligent and purposeful in their pattern. As darkness fell over the mountains, The whistling began again. This time, Daniel was able to determine that the sounds were coming from at least 3 different locations. High peaks that surrounded his valley like ancient sentinels watching over an intruder in their domain. The pattern was always the same. 2 sharp whistles separated by 3 seconds, repeated 3 times. Then silence. But now there seemed to be a response pattern, with whistles from one peak being answered by whistles from another, as if unseen entities were communicating about his presence. Daniel spent a sleepless night listening to the supernatural communication network that seemed to operate throughout the mountain range. The whistles continued at irregular intervals, always following the same pattern but coming from different locations, as if the entities producing them were mobile and coordinating their movements. The psychological effect was profoundly unsettling, creating a sense of being observed and evaluated by intelligences that operated according to rules he couldn't understand. Friday morning brought no relief from the mysterious phenomena. As Daniel broke camp and continued his patrol, he noticed that the local wildlife was behaving strangely. Deer that should have been grazing peacefully in the alpine meadows were instead clustered together in nervous groups, constantly scanning the peaks as if watching for threats from above. Mountain goats that normally showed little fear of humans fled at his approach, and even the usually bold marmots had disappeared from their rocky territories. The whistling resumed during daylight hours, but now Daniel could see something that made his blood run cold. High on the surrounding peaks, he could make out dark figures silhouetted against the sky, positioned at points where the whistles seemed to originate. The figures were too distant to make out clearly, but they appeared to be human in shape, while being impossibly tall and thin. They stood motionless for hours at a time, then would suddenly disappear, only to reappear on different peaks, always maintaining their vigil over the valley where Daniel was conducting his patrol. As the day progressed, Daniel realized that the whistling entities were following his movements, repositioning themselves to maintain constant observation of his location. Whenever he changed direction or moved to a new area, the figures on the peaks would shift accordingly, always staying at the same relative distance while maintaining their mysterious communication network. The pattern suggested intelligence and coordination that went far beyond anything he had encountered in his years of wilderness experience. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter was the gradual realization that the whistles were not just communication. They were an invitation. As Daniel listened more carefully to the pattern, he began to understand that the entities were calling to him, trying to lure him away from the relative safety of the valley floor toward the high peaks where they maintained their watch. The whistles had a hypnotic quality that seemed to bypass his rational mind and appeal directly to some primitive part of his consciousness that wanted to respond to the call. Friday night brought the most intense episode of supernatural activity. The whistling became almost constant, with multiple entities calling from different peaks in a complex symphony of sound that echoed throughout the mountain range. Daniel found himself standing outside his tent, staring up at the dark figures on the peaks and feeling an almost overwhelming urge to begin climbing toward them. Only his years of wilderness training and survival instincts kept him anchored to the valley floor and away from the entities that were so clearly trying to draw him into their domain. The psychological pressure continued throughout the night, with the whistling entities maintaining their vigil and their invitation. Daniel could see lights moving on the peaks, not the warm glow of campfires, but cold, blue illumination that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whistling sounds. The lights would appear and disappear in patterns that suggested the entities were performing some kind of ritual or ceremony, with Daniel as the intended focus of their otherworldly attention. Saturday morning brought the decision to abandon his patrol and return to civilization immediately. Daniel had completed enough of his survey to file a report, and the psychological strain of being constantly watched and called by the whistling entities was beginning to affect his judgment and decision-making abilities. As he packed his gear and prepared to leave the valley, the whistling intensified, as if the entities were making one final attempt to prevent his departure. The hike out became a test of willpower as the whistling followed him for miles, always maintaining the same pattern but growing more insistent and urgent as he moved away from the high peaks. Daniel forced himself to maintain a steady pace and resist the growing compulsion to turn around and answer the call that seemed to promise answers to questions he didn't even know he was asking. Only when he reached the lower elevations did the whistling finally fade, leaving him with a profound sense of relief, mixed with an inexplicable feeling of loss. Daniel's official report described unusual acoustic phenomena that might be related to wind patterns and geological formations. But he never mentioned the dark figures on the peaks or the hypnotic quality of the whistling sounds. The area remained closed to public access, officially due to unstable trail conditions. But Daniel knew the real reason was to protect hikers from entities that viewed human visitors as potential recruits for purposes that remained terrifyingly unclear. The experience fundamentally changed Daniel's relationship with wilderness solitude, leaving him with the knowledge that some places are inhabited by intelligences that predate human understanding and operate according to rules that transcend natural law. The whistling entities continue to maintain their vigil in the high peaks of the San Juan Range, calling to those who venture too deep into their ancient domain and offering invitations that promise transformation but deliver only disappearance into the vast mystery of the mountains. Daniel never returned to that section of the wilderness, and he quietly transferred to a different ranger district where the mountains held fewer secrets and the whistling winds carried only the voices of natural forces rather than the calls of entities that bridge the gap between the known and unknown worlds of the American wilderness. Let's move to our 10th story. In the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, where towering evergreens create a perpetual twilight beneath their canopy, a group of urban explorers encountered entities that defied every law of nature and physics. This happened to Amanda Chen and her team of paranormal investigators during what should have been a routine exploration of abandoned logging camps in November 2022, deep in the Olympic National Forest of Washington. What they discovered in those fog-shrouded woods would leave them questioning the very nature of reality and the boundaries between the physical and supernatural worlds. Amanda had been leading paranormal investigation teams for over a decade, specializing in locations where unexplained phenomena had been reported by multiple witnesses. Her current team consisted of 5 experienced investigators equipped with advanced recording equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, and thermal imaging cameras. They were investigating reports of strange sightings at the ruins of a logging camp that had been abandoned in the 1970s after a series of unexplained accidents and worker disappearances that had never been satisfactorily explained by authorities. The abandoned logging camp was located in a remote section of the Olympic Peninsula, accessible only by following overgrown logging roads that wound through dense forests of Douglas fir, western red cedar, and Sitka spruce. The camp itself consisted of several collapsed buildings, rusted machinery, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving industrial operation. Local folklore claimed that the camp had been abandoned not due to economic factors, but because of supernatural encounters that had terrorized the workers and made continued operation impossible. Amanda's team arrived at the site on Thursday afternoon, setting up their base camp in the ruins of what had been the main office building. The location had an immediately oppressive atmosphere that affected even the most skeptical members of the team. The forest around the camp was unnaturally quiet, with none of the typical sounds of Pacific Northwest wildlife that should have been abundant in such a pristine ecosystem. The silence was so complete that it seemed to absorb sound, making their voices sound flat and lifeless in the thick air. The first night of investigation proceeded according to their established protocols. The team set up recording equipment throughout the ruins, monitoring electromagnetic fields, temperature fluctuations, and audio anomalies that might indicate paranormal activity. Initial readings showed unusual electromagnetic signatures that suggested the presence of energies that their instruments couldn't properly identify or categorize. The temperature readings were inconsistent, with cold spots that seemed to move through the ruins without any apparent natural cause. It was around midnight on Thursday when they encountered the first of the cloaked shadows. Team member Jake Morrison was monitoring the thermal imaging equipment when he noticed a figure moving through the ruins that appeared as a dark silhouette against the infrared display. The figure was roughly human in shape, but seemed to be composed of shadow rather than solid matter, moving with a fluid grace that defied normal human locomotion. When Jake called the others' attention to the thermal display, the figure had vanished, leaving no trace of its presence. Over the next hour, the cloaked shadows began appearing with increasing frequency. The entities seemed to be observing the investigation team, always staying at the edge of their equipment's detection range, but clearly maintaining surveillance of their activities. The shadows appeared to be wearing long, flowing garments that obscured any details of their physical form, and they moved with a coordinated intelligence that suggested they were communicating with each other through means the investigators couldn't detect. Amanda's electromagnetic field detectors began registering massive spikes whenever the shadows appeared, indicating the presence of energies that far exceeded anything they had encountered in previous investigations. The readings were so intense that several pieces of equipment began malfunctioning, with digital displays showing impossible values and recording devices capturing audio that consisted of nothing but static and what sounded like whispered conversations in an unknown language. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter was the shadows' apparent ability to interact with the physical world, despite their insubstantial appearance. Team members reported feeling cold touches on their shoulders and arms, as if invisible hands were reaching out to make contact. Equipment that had been carefully positioned began moving on its own, repositioned in patterns that seemed deliberately arranged to spell out messages or symbols that none of the investigators could interpret. As the night progressed, the cloaked shadows became more bold in their interactions with the investigation team. They began appearing in the peripheral vision of team members, always disappearing when observed directly, but leaving behind a sense of being watched by intelligences that were evaluating the intruders and their intentions. The psychological pressure was intense, creating an atmosphere of dread that made even the most experienced investigators question their decision to remain in the abandoned camp. Around 3 a.m, the shadows revealed their most terrifying characteristic: their eyes. In the darkness of the ruined buildings, team members began seeing pairs of glowing eyes that seemed to float independently of any visible body. The eyes were an unnatural blue-white color that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and they appeared at various heights and angles that suggested the entities possessing them were not bound by normal physical limitations. The glowing eyes began appearing in increasing numbers, surrounding the investigation team and creating a circle of supernatural surveillance that made escape seem impossible. Amanda counted at least 12 pairs of eyes, watching them from different positions throughout the ruins, all maintaining the same unblinking stare that seemed to penetrate directly into their souls. The eyes moved independently of each other, sometimes appearing high in the skeletal remains of buildings, other times at ground level, as if the entities could position themselves anywhere within their domain. The psychological impact of being surrounded by the glowing eyes was overwhelming. Team members reported feeling dizzy, disoriented, and experiencing a growing sense of unreality that made them question whether they were still in the physical world or had somehow crossed into a supernatural realm where different rules applied. The electromagnetic readings continued to spike, and their recording equipment began capturing images and sounds that seemed to come from multiple dimensions simultaneously. The climax of the encounter came when the cloaked shadows began to materialize more solidly, revealing glimpses of their true nature that challenged everything the investigators thought they knew about paranormal phenomena. The entities appeared to be wearing hooded robes that seemed to be made of living shadow, constantly shifting and flowing as if composed of darkness itself. Beneath the hoods, instead of faces, there was only void, an absence of light and substance that hurt to look at directly. One of the shadows approached Amanda directly, moving with a gliding motion that left no footprints in the soft earth of the forest floor. As it drew closer, she could feel an intense cold that seemed to emanate from the entity, a chill that went beyond physical temperature and seemed to freeze her very soul. The shadow extended what might have been an arm toward her, and she felt an overwhelming compulsion to reach out and make contact with the supernatural being. Only the intervention of her team members prevented Amanda from touching the cloaked shadow, breaking the hypnotic spell that had been drawing her toward the entity. The moment the connection was broken, all of the shadows vanished simultaneously, leaving the investigation team alone in the ruins with only their malfunctioning equipment and the memory of glowing eyes that had watched them from the darkness. The remainder of the night passed in tense silence, with the team maintaining a defensive perimeter while their equipment slowly returned to normal function. The electromagnetic readings gradually decreased, and the oppressive atmosphere that had dominated the site began to lift as dawn approached. But the investigators knew they had encountered something that transcended normal paranormal activity. Entities that existed in a realm between the physical and spiritual worlds. Amanda's team packed their equipment and left the abandoned logging camp as soon as there was enough daylight to safely navigate the overgrown roads. The experience had shaken even the most experienced investigators, leaving them with the knowledge that some places harbor entities that are neither fully dead nor entirely alive. Beings that exist in the shadows between worlds and observe the living with purposes that remain terrifyingly unclear. The investigation footage and audio recordings were largely unusable, corrupted by the intense electromagnetic interference that had accompanied the shadow entities. But the team members' testimonies were consistent and detailed, describing encounters with beings that possessed intelligence, coordination, and abilities that challenged every assumption about the nature of paranormal phenomena. The abandoned logging camp remains a site of supernatural activity, guarded by cloaked shadows that continue to watch over their domain, with glowing eyes that see far more than any living being should be able to perceive. Amanda disbanded her investigation team after the Olympic Peninsula encounter, unable to risk exposing other researchers to entities that had demonstrated the ability to affect both physical equipment and human consciousness in ways that suggested powers beyond current understanding. The cloaked shadows continue their eternal vigil in the ruins of the logging camp, waiting for the next group of investigators brave enough or foolish enough to venture into their supernatural domain. Let's move to our final story. In the ancient woodlands of the Great Smoky Mountains, where mist clings to ridges like the breath of sleeping giants, a trauma counselor discovered that some places hold memories that can drive visitors to madness. This happened to Dr. Rebecca Martinez during what should have been a therapeutic retreat in October 2023, deep in the most remote sections of the national park. What she experienced in those haunted hollows would end her career and leave her with a terrifying knowledge that certain forests remember every act of violence committed within their boundaries. Dr. Martinez had been treating patients with severe PTSD for over 12 years, specializing in cases involving violent crimes and traumatic experiences that left lasting psychological scars. She had developed a reputation for helping the most difficult cases, using innovative therapeutic techniques that combine traditional counseling with wilderness therapy. Her current patient was a young woman named Lisa, who had survived a brutal assault in a remote forest location, and Dr. Martinez believed that returning to a similar wilderness environment under controlled conditions might help her patient overcome her trauma. The location Dr. Martinez chose for this experimental therapy session was a secluded valley in the Great Smoky Mountains, accessible only by a challenging 6-mile hike through dense forest that few visitors ever attempted. The valley was known for its pristine beauty and complete isolation from the modern world, making it an ideal location for intensive therapeutic work without distractions. What Dr. Martinez didn't know was that this particular valley had been the site of numerous violent crimes over the past century, creating a concentration of traumatic energy that had soaked into the very soil of the forest. They arrived at the valley on Tuesday morning, setting up a small camp beside a crystal-clear stream that wound through the hollow like a silver ribbon. The location was breathtakingly beautiful, surrounded by ancient hardwood trees that created a natural cathedral of green and gold. Lisa seemed to respond positively to the peaceful environment, and Dr. Martinez was optimistic that the wilderness setting would provide the breakthrough her patient needed to overcome her psychological barriers. The first indication that something was wrong came during their initial therapy session on Tuesday afternoon. As Dr. Martinez guided Lisa through relaxation exercises designed to help her process her traumatic memories, both women began experiencing vivid flashbacks that didn't belong to either of them. They saw scenes of violence and terror that had occurred in the valley decades earlier. Murders, assaults, and disappearances that had never been solved or even reported to authorities. The visions were so intense and detailed that they felt like personal memories rather than imagination. Dr. Martinez initially attributed the shared hallucinations to the power of suggestion and the emotional intensity of the therapeutic process. But as the sessions continued, the visions became more frequent and more disturbing. The forest itself seemed to be broadcasting the traumatic memories of every violent act that had ever occurred within its boundaries, creating a psychic echo chamber that overwhelmed anyone sensitive enough to receive the transmissions. Both women found themselves reliving murders, rapes, and tortures that had happened to complete strangers in the same location where they were trying to heal. Wednesday brought an escalation of the supernatural phenomena that made continued therapy impossible. The valley began manifesting physical evidence of the traumatic events that Dr. Martinez and Lisa were experiencing in their visions. They found blood stains on rocks that hadn't been there the day before, heard screams echoing through the forest that seemed to come from the past, and discovered personal belongings scattered throughout the woods that belonged to victims of crimes that had occurred decades earlier. The most disturbing aspect of their ordeal was the realization that the forest was not just replaying traumatic memories. It was actively trying to recreate the violent events using Dr. Martinez and Lisa as unwilling participants. The women found themselves being drawn to specific locations within the valley, where they would suddenly be overwhelmed by compulsions to reenact the violent scenes they had witnessed in their visions. The forest seemed to be using their own psychological vulnerabilities against them, exploiting their trauma to fuel its supernatural appetite for violence. Lisa's condition deteriorated rapidly as the forest's influence intensified. She began experiencing complete dissociative episodes where she would take on the personalities of previous victims, speaking in voices that weren't her own and describing details of crimes that had never been publicly reported. During these episodes, she would attempt to harm herself in ways that matched the injuries suffered by the historical victims, as if the forest was trying to complete the traumatic cycles that had been interrupted by the passage of time. Dr. Martinez realized that they were trapped in a location where the boundary between past and present had been eroded by the concentration of traumatic energy. The forest had become a repository of human suffering that actively sought to perpetuate itself by drawing new victims into its cycle of violence. Every act of brutality that had occurred in the valley had left a psychic imprint that fed on the emotional energy of visitors, growing stronger with each new traumatic experience. Thursday night brought the climax of their supernatural ordeal when the forest began manifesting the actual perpetrators of the historical crimes. Dr. Martinez and Lisa found themselves confronted by shadowy figures that seemed to be composed of malevolent energy and traumatic memory. Entities that had been created by the violent acts committed in the valley and now existed as permanent residents of the haunted landscape. These shadow beings attempted to force the women to participate in reenactments of their crimes, using psychological manipulation and supernatural coercion to break down their resistance. The escape from the valley became a desperate flight through a forest that actively opposed their departure. The trails seemed to shift and change, leading them in circles and preventing them from finding the path that would take them back to safety. The shadow entities pursued them through the woods, whispering threats and promises that echoed the words of long-dead criminals who had once terrorized victims in the same location. Only Dr. Martinez's professional training in crisis intervention and Lisa's survivor instincts allowed them to maintain enough psychological coherence to eventually find their way out of the supernatural trap. When they finally reached civilization, both women required extensive medical and psychological treatment to recover from their exposure to the forest's traumatic energy. Lisa's original trauma had been compounded by the supernatural experiences, leaving her with multiple personality fragments that belonged to historical victims of the valley's violence. Dr. Martinez suffered a complete psychological breakdown that ended her career and left her unable to practice therapy or even discuss her professional experiences without triggering severe panic attacks. The investigation that followed their ordeal revealed the true history of the valley. Over the past century, it had been the site of at least 15 unsolved murders, dozens of sexual assaults, and numerous disappearances that had never been explained by conventional law enforcement. The concentration of violent crimes in such a small area had created a supernatural phenomenon that transformed the location into a psychic wound that continued to bleed traumatic energy into the present day. Dr. Martinez never returned to her practice, and she spent the remainder of her career warning other mental health professionals about the dangers of conducting therapy in locations with histories of violence and trauma. She learned that some places are so saturated with human suffering that they become actively malevolent, seeking to perpetuate cycles of violence by drawing new victims into their supernatural web. The valley in the Great Smoky Mountains remains a site of ongoing supernatural activity, a forest that remembers every act of brutality committed within its boundaries and hungers for new traumatic experiences to add to its collection. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Martinez's experience was the realization that trauma can become a living force that transcends individual psychology and takes on a supernatural existence of its own. The forest had become a repository of collective human suffering that actively sought to perpetuate itself, demonstrating that some wounds in the fabric of reality never heal and continue to bleed pain and terror into the world of the living. Before we conclude tonight's journey into the darkest corners of the wilderness, let me share some crucial advice that could save your life. The stories you've heard tonight aren't just entertainment. They're warnings about the very real dangers that exist in remote wilderness areas. Whether you're dealing with human predators, supernatural entities, or psychological phenomena that science can't yet explain, preparation and awareness are your best defenses. Always inform someone of your exact location and expected return time before venturing into remote areas. Carry multiple forms of communication, including satellite communicators that work beyond cell tower range. Trust your instincts. If a location feels wrong or dangerous, leave immediately regardless of how much planning you've invested. Travel in groups whenever possible, and never ignore the warnings of local guides or indigenous peoples who understand the true nature of the places you're visiting. Most importantly, remember that some places demand respect that goes beyond environmental conservation. The wilderness holds secrets that predate human civilization, and not all of them are meant to be discovered by the curious or the unprepared. If you've made it this far into our descent into terror, you're clearly someone who appreciates the darker truths about our world. Don't let this journey end here. Subscribe to Verified Fears and hit that notification bell because we're just getting started. Every week, we bring you the horror stories that others are too afraid to tell, the encounters that challenge everything you thought you knew about reality. Share this video with someone brave enough to handle the truth and let us know in the comments which story disturbed you the most. Until next time, remember, the woods are always watching, Icars, and now you know what might be watching back. Stay afraid, stay aware, and we'll see you in the shadows.